Hey, it's so great that you guys came to our small group night. I'm so glad that I'm with you right now. We're going to get to the message pretty quick here, but before we do that, I just want to do one quick announcement, and that is that we are having our Christmas party on December 10th. It is going to be $20. We're meeting at the Movie Mill at 6:30. And so you want to be there on time so you get your ticket, your popcorn, your drink. You can get in the doors. And don't forget, we're going to be posting some different options of movies on Instagram for you guys to vote for. And so you want to be following along with our stories so that we know which movie we should be playing at the Movie Mill. And also, don't forget that almost half of that money that you pay for your ticket is actually going to the Harbor House, a women's shelter right here in Lethbridge, so that we can give women and children some toys for Christmas so they don't miss out on the fun. So it's my pleasure to introduce Chelsea, who's going to be doing the message today.
So last week, we started a new series that is all about this tendency that we have to go through life with an us and them mentality. This idea that we're not for one another, but we're actually us against them. We do this with people, we do this with our friends, we do this in relationships at school, and we do this with God. So often, we see people as our enemies, but God is inviting us into something different. Not only is God for us, but God actually calls us to be for one another. Now, being for one another is something that, as I've been pondering this week about this message, something that I think I struggle with more than I want to admit. I think about when I was your age in high school, being for one another wasn't always the easiest thing to do. But that's not something that ended in high school for me. As I sit and reflect on my life and reflect on the relationships I have even to this day, sometimes I find that I'm not for the people around me. And I've spent realizing that I actually still struggle with an us and them mentality. It's so easy for me to put my walls up against the people that I disagree with, against people that believe things that are different than I believe. When someone's really different from me and I don't understand them, I have an us and them mentality. I'm reminded how in elementary school, it was, if I was mad at someone, I would just stop talking to them, give them the silent treatment, pretend like you didn't hear them talking, which seems really childish. And when you think back to elementary school, maybe you can remember some moments that you behaved like that. If you were mad at someone and you just ignored them. But the reality is sometimes we still do that, and it might look different. For me, it's not that I give them the silent treatment, but I actually just avoid the people that make me uncomfortable. So here's a question for you to think about. Have you ever found yourself in a time where you are giving someone the silent treatment, or maybe you're avoiding someone because of a disagreement? Or has someone ever done this to you? How does that make you feel when you recognize that this is something that you do? And how do you feel when you recognize someone is doing this to you? We don't all want the same things in life. We don't all agree on the same things. We don't have the same views about everything. There's many things that separate each of us from one another. There are so many things that create these imaginary lines that separate each of us. There's reasons why we separate ourselves from other people. Maybe it's because there's someone that doesn't treat us well, or we see someone not treating others well, and we want to separate from them. Or we see people that are really different from us and we don't know how to build relationships with them, so we separate ourselves from them. Sometimes in school it's because of our grades, because of the sports we're involved in, because of different kinds of social circles that we sit in. We build these lines that separate each of us from one another. When God created everything, when He created us as humans, we weren't designed to be separate from each other. God created us to be in relationship with each other. But we've messed this up. We have created dividing lines between us and God, and we've created dividing lines between us and others. We have a tendency to make people our enemies. We act like our survival depends on seeing the world through my own lens. My success is if I know where I'm going, and that's all that matters. I choose me. My view is what's most important and nothing else. But God doesn't operate that way. When God looks at us, he says, it's not me or you, it's me for you. And last week we talked about how God is for us. But there are ways that we are called to be for one another. So a question for you to think about is, what are areas in your life that you have created a dividing line between you and other people in your life? Last week, we talked about how God is for us and has always been for us. From the beginning of history, God has had a plan in place for us to restore relationship with Him that we had broken, both with God and with each other. We talked about God's work in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve and his plan to restore the broken relationship. And we talked about God's promise to Abraham and how we are part of this plan. God promised to make Abraham's descendants a great nation, which God did. The nation of Israel grew for generations and generations, but it didn't always happen as we expected. And that's not all that God promised them. God told Abraham that he would be blessed. God told Abraham that he was going to bless Israel and was going to bless the whole world. This idea was new and revolutionary for its time. The nations of the world were not trying to figure out how to bless one another. They were trying to destroy one another, to conquer one another, and to enslave each other. And so last week we left Abraham at a moment where God called him to leave his land, his people, everything he knew, to leave his identity behind and to follow God on a new adventure. And Abraham did. He left everything he knew behind because God called him into something different. But this is different than the movies we watch on TV where there's a trial that the main character has to face, and in the end, they all live happily ever after. This is not how this story plays out. Abraham leaves, and Israel is off to a really slow start to become a great nation. Slowly but surely, Abraham's descendants grew, and the nation grew very large. But over time, they were enslaved in Egypt, but God rescued them. Then they wandered in the desert for 40 years, wondering if God was going to show up. Where was God leading him? And God led them into the promised land. Finally, the nation of Israel got a king, and they had many kings, and things seemed to be going really well. But after hundreds of years, God's original promise to Abraham, the nation of Israel, kept messing up this promise and this plan that God had for them. Over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament, we see Israel's messing up, making mistakes. Israel turns its back on God over and over again. They choose to create their own rules, their own plans for their life, instead of turning to God's authority and God's plan for them. They kept forgetting that God's promise was that you will be a blessing to everyone on earth. And instead of being a blessing, Israel hurt and oppressed other people. So from here, God sent prophets, people who challenged God's people to get serious about what it meant to follow after God's plan, what it meant to walk in God's promise, and to be for one another. But even with prophets, Israel continued to struggle. But God never stopped being for Israel. God has never stopped being for those who are struggling to follow his plan. Being for someone means you're for their growth, you're for the process of their pursuit. And sometimes helping someone grow means that we actually have to dive into some of the struggles, some of the consequences of the decisions we've made. So God allowed the nation of Israel to take captive and to become captive and enslaved once again, and this time by the nations of Babylon and Assyria. We're going to look at scripture. We're going to turn to Jeremiah chapter 1, and we're going to read through that together as our small group. In their captivity, God sent a prophet named Jeremiah to speak the message that Israel needed to hear. But it was a message that Israel wasn't going to like. So as you read in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 1 to 9, you see this country that was overtaken by an enemy nation. A nation that was evil and had horrible things going on. Imagine yourself in this situation. Imagine that your land is now being taken over by someone else. Imagine that everything that you have built up is being taken away, and you're suddenly living in enemy territory. Imagine how you would hate the people around you for destroying the life you knew, and how you would hope that maybe their lives would be destructed. This is how Israel felt. But Jeremiah tells Israel to do something completely different, and something that was counterintuitive to what they wanted, maybe even offensive to the Israelites as they were living in a land that was taken from them. Jeremiah told them, make your home here, live in enemy territory, build your houses and settle here. Turn your enemies into your friends, take care of the land, plant gardens and seek peace. These are things that don't happen overnight. These are things that take time, that take intention, that take love. Instead of hoping that your enemies are going to be destroyed, God told them to hope that their enemies would be blessed, that the people that stole everything from them would be blessed. When Israel wanted to say, it's us or them, Jeremiah said, no, it's us for them, because we are called to be for others. God was reminding Israel of the very thing God had promised Abraham so long ago. God's people were going to do things differently. God's people would be for others just like God had been for them. Here's the thing though, Israel didn't believe it. They were convinced that God would rescue them, that God would destroy their enemies, that he would give them their land back. And so it was ridiculous to try and make peace. It was ridiculous to try and be comfortable in this land that was taken from them. They didn't care about Babylon, they just cared about themselves. Israel wanted their enemies destroyed, but God had something better in mind. So read in your groups together Jeremiah 29, verse 10 and 11 together. God's plans didn't look like Israel's plans. They would be in captivity for more than 70 years, but God said those plans were not meant to harm them, but they were meant for a hope of a future. Does that verse sound familiar at all? It's a verse that many of us know, that God has a plan and a hope for your future, and we live in this, but that's not the full picture of what that verse means. It happens in many places where we try and encourage people in the steps that they're making in their lives, that God has a hope and a plan for their future. But what is actually happening here is that it's not just a promise that someday everything is going to be better, but it's a call and a reminder about who God is. It's a reminder that God is for us and that God is for his people. And as his people, we are called to be for one another, that our hopes and plans for a future are a bigger calling than just everything's going to turn out okay. Just like God is for us, we are to be for one another. And this has been God's message to us from the very beginning. Many years after Jeremiah, God showed us exactly what it looks like to be for people, what it looks like to be for your enemies. So we're going to turn to John chapter 3, and I'm going to read verse 16 and 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. So here we have a picture of God sending his Son Jesus into enemy territory to show us how much he loves us. God has called us to do the same. God has sent his Son into the entire world because he is for all of his people, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done. God sent Jesus for the world, and he calls us to be for the world. He calls us to make friends with our enemies, to make our home in a place that is not our own, and to seek peace and well-being with everyone around us. God calls us to be for one another. And as I think about this more and more in my own life, what does it mean to be for one another? To be for those that are my enemies, to be for those who are different than me. And this is something that is really hard for us to do. In my own life, I've spent the last many years working in the education system, and I worked as an educational assistant. And for me, it was my job to work with kids that didn't have a place in the classroom because of either learning difficulties or behavioral difficulties. And these were the kids that were on the outskirts, the kids that people weren't for because they had outbursts in the classrooms that made people uncomfortable. And I was constantly challenged with the fact that to be for people that are different, you actually have to lean in. It takes relationships, it takes time, it takes effort. And this was really difficult to wrestle with what it means to be for those that are different than us. So I want you to think about this in your own life. What is it for you to be for those that are different? Who are the people that you are separating yourself from? Who are the people that are different enough that make you uncomfortable? Who are the people that you need to lean into to be for them? Levi and I and a whole bunch of all of your small group leaders are part of youth because we're for you. And often it seems like society is against youth. You're all messed up and you all are making horrible life choices and there's no hope for our future, but that's not true. And that's not what we believe, and that is not why we show up every week. We want to build relationships with you. We know that what you're wrestling through in life matters. We are for you. And in this place, we're for one another. And as we continue to build relationships, we're going to dive into what it looks like to be for one another in this community. What if you saw the people around you? And if you saw them and were for them, just as much as you were hoping that you would be seen. As we go through this as a youth group, as we continue to work through this series, we're going to process what it means as God is for us, that we be for one another, and how we're following God's example. How can we be for people and not against them? There are many different practices that this can look like, and we're going to spend some time in small groups reflecting on what this looks like for each of us.